And thank you everybody for coming this evening. It's awesome to see so much interest in moths, which I think are very underrated. So um, tonight I'll be talking about um, or trying to introduce you to the wonderful world of moths, their beauty, their uniqueness. We'll talk about what makes a moth, why they're so vitally important to our ecosystems, and how to find and attract them. So most of these photos are mine. There are a couple other photos in here that belong to a couple friends of mine, but I didn't take any from the internet for once. So let's just hop right into it. So right off the bat, first thing I want to stress is there are so many moths. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of moths, especially when we compare to butterflies, which most people are more familiar with butterflies. Definitely the monarch has become quite a flagship species, just in terms of representation for preserving not only wild native habitat, but habitat in our own yards. Like Peggy was explaining, the Chicago Living Corridors and associated organizations are really trying to promote. So just to give you an idea of how many moths there are worldwide, there's estimated to be about 300,000 species of Lepidoptera, which are the family of insects that make up moths and butterflies. So only about 1,500 of those are butterflies, which means the rest of them, about 285,000 species, are moths. When you start to break that down to North America, it's about 11 to 12,000 moths versus 750 butterflies. In Illinois, that breaks down to only about 150 species of butterfly, which isn't that many, versus almost 2,000 species of moths. So moths definitely outnumber the butterflies by quite a bit. And why is that? Moths are a lot older than butterflies, and butterflies evolved from moths. So moths are about 250 to 300 million years old. Butterflies came around about 200,000 or 200 million years later, about the dawn of flowering plants, which happened about 130 million years ago. So moths, when they were first around, they fed on plants primarily. So, and that adaptation is still around today in the caterpillars, whereas adult moths and adult butterflies have that long proboscis, that long tubular tongue in which they visit flowers to extract nectar as their primary food source. But way back in the day, moths used to just chew on the plant parts. But with when flowering plants really started to dominate, they started to switch over to that proboscis, that nectar feeding habit. And it's important though to remember that the caterpillars still feed on the plant parts, and we'll get into that more later as why that's important. So again, just to break it down a little more, the family tree, I put in this little red bracket here. That's your butterflies here in this family tree of moths and butterflies. The rest are all moths. So again, butterflies have been around such a shorter period of time than the moths, but that's why they're so similar. So what makes a moth when we're generally speaking? Because again, moths and butterflies are basically the same thing. There's really not too much, even genetically, difference between them. But when we're talking about them, you'll see, if you look up online, what's the difference between a moth and a butterfly, you typically get something like this, a meme or a little chart or some type of graphic that says, okay, this is what makes a moth, this is what makes a butterfly. So you'll see on the moth side, active at night, nocturnal versus the daytime habits of a butterfly. Moths are, you'll hear this all the time. Moths are dull, they're boring, they're ugly versus, beautiful, bright, colorful butterflies. Wings rest at their sides versus together and upright, feathered and pointed antenna versus straight and clubbed antenna, thick body versus skinny body. So again, sort of a general comparison. But if you notice at the bottom, there's a little asterisk that says there's some exceptions. And when it really comes down to telling the difference between these two, it's very complicated. It's not quite as black and white as that sort of simplistic chart makes it seem. This is a great example, probably the most famous example. This is called the butterfly moth. It is a moth, but it looks a lot like a butterfly. It's kind of more shaped like a butterfly. It's got clubbed antenna. It's not like fuzzy like we think of moths. So when it comes down to telling the difference, it gets very fuzzy. It can be very difficult. So let's kind of break down that little simplistic chart a lot. So are moths active at night primarily? Are they nocturnal primarily? And generally, yes. Yes, they are. Most of them are active at night. However, a lot of them are active during the day. Here's just some examples of moths, and these are all from my yard. Pictures taken in my own yard, which is only a little quarter acre property, typical suburban house, garage. I've converted a lot of it to native plants. So these are moths that I get all the time, especially these looper moths. And as their names suggest, soybean looper, celery looper, corn earworm moth, they're named after crops that they tend to be a pest on, because again, those caterpillars, they like to eat plants and they got the munchy mouth parts, so they can be pretty destructive in the agricultural industry, which is why a lot of pesticide use and a lot of things that can be harmful, not just to insects, but also to people, are used to combat those caterpillars and maximize crop yields. But anyway, these are moths that you can find pretty common around and active during the day. So, looking in a patch of flowers in a prairie area, or even in your own garden, you can see these moths flying around. You can see them also at night. I have seen them flying around, same garden beds, just, flitting around there, but active during the day. These are what I call the three blacks. Probably no one else calls them that, but in our area, these are three moths that are pretty common that you can see during the daytime. They're active during the daytime. The first two, the Virginia Coochna, I'm probably saying that wrong, and the yellow-collared scape moth, those two are very similar looking. They're in the same family. They're both, black, long-bodied. They got the long kind of comb antenna and yellowish heads. But those are two you can see almost anywhere during the day, especially during certain times of year when they're very active. The grape leaf skeletonizer moth, great name, is also active during the day. A little bit harder to find than the other two, but it's still around. So that's another one to just keep an eye out for. You may have already seen some of these already, and maybe not even known they were a moth. Borers are another great example of day-flying moths. If you see that squash vine borer, that's one you probably don't want to see if you grow pumpkins or squash or any type of cucurbit. If you've experienced in your garden where you're growing a squash or a pumpkin and like a whole section will just suddenly die off, it could be one of these borers, the squash vine borer, just by the way they bore into a vine and lay their eggs, and the caterpillars can wreak havoc on your pumpkin patch. But they are a cool looking moth. Same with this raspberry crown I went too fast. Same with this raspberry crown borer. It actually mimics a wasp, sort of looking moth. Very pretty big too. That's another one you can definitely see around here. Same with this smaller guy. This is another type of borer. Doesn't have a common name. You'll find some moths that don't have common names, which it kind of makes them a little more tricky to follow, because for most people trying to say the Latin name is tough. At least for me it is, I know. The clearwings, these two, kind of the famous moths, I call them, the hummingbird clearwing and the snowberry clearwing. Two common, beautiful moths, pretty big moths, very, very noticeable, especially if you have a garden or a walk through any prairie area, especially with tubular flowers. They love Monarda, like on the left there. But this is a common one you can see. Very beautiful, two very, very beautiful moths. A lot of people like to get a lot of pictures and share them on Facebook because they are very cool looking. There's a couple other different types of clearwings and hawk moths like this, but these are the two most common ones around here. Forage loopers, another common one that I see a lot around here. Just walking a trail, they'll kind of pop up in the grass and then, kind of dive back down and try to hide from you. But they can vary quite a bit in how they look, which is another tricky part about moths. Even among the same family, they can look quite different. So these are all forage looper moths. But they all look a little different, but this is a common one you can see. And they're fairly big too, maybe an inch and a half long, but definitely keep an eye out for them. Caterpillars is another great thing to go looking for during the daytime. I'm sure many of you have looked for monarch caterpillars, or maybe you've had black swallowtail caterpillars in your dill, or your carrots or something like that. They love your carrots. So this is you can definitely go out and look for caterpillars during the day. They come in all different shapes and colors and sizes. This Carolina sphinx, or tobacco hookworm as they're known, are very big. And you don't really want them in your tomato patch because they will eat your tomato plants. They're very gregarious. But you get hairy moths, you get ones that are super fuzzy, ones that look more spiky. This camouflage looper is one of my favorites, and a super cool little caterpillar that has a unique evolutionary adaptation. And that is that if you look closely at it, it's got those kind of curly, it looks like dried up petals or dried up leaves, and that's exactly what they are. This caterpillar has actually figured out a way to use tools by taking plant material and attaching it to itself in order to help camouflage it from predators. So when it's crawling around the garden, it blends in a lot more than if it were to just be naked, so to speak. So it's a rare case of an insect actually using a tool to aid in its survival. So very cool little guy. And that turns into a really cool moth called the wavy line emerald, which I do have a picture of in here. So I'll point that out when we get to it. But that's one to definitely look for in your garden, just crawling around. Another caterpillar I'm sure most anybody has seen, especially in late fall, is the woolly bears, the banded woolly bear, or maybe even the yellow woolly bear caterpillars. Very fuzzy little guys. There's a lot of folklore around the banded woolly bear, about the length of the orange band is going to determine how severe the winter is. I don't know how true that is, but if the ones I've been seeing lately, if it's any indication, it's going to be a warm winter. So we'll see if that pans out. But the banded woolly bear is a good example of just that caterpillars and moths in general Also have a lot of cultural significance. A lot of cultures have a lot of myths around moths and around caterpillars. Just like that black witch on the main slide, that very beautiful purpley shimmery moth. That one is known as the moth of death, and especially in Aztec culture. And if any of you have read Silence of the Lambs, that is the moth used in the book as the calling card for the killer Buffalo Bill. So a little movie trivia for you there too. But these are, again, some more common moths and common caterpillars that you'll see during the day in our area. So this is my favorite one that I see all the time. You know, moths are boring, moths are dull, moths are ugly. And sure, some moths are very plain looking, because they're trying to camouflage in the leaf litter or against tree bark or against leaves or whatever it is in order to blend in and avoid predation. So like this large maple spanworm moth in the upper left-hand corner, it looks like a dried up leaf, basically. It's pretty big. It's probably 3 to 4 inches across. And it, if you were to just see that sitting there in a pile of leaves, it would blend right in. Same with like that bird, that small bird dropping moth, lovely name. But it does look like a little pile of bird poop. So great, you know, it's an interesting camouflage adaptation of that particular moth. But like the bad wing, it's green, it wants to blend in with green leaves. That's usually where you'll find them. The asteroid, which is I think one of the coolest names of moths. Moth common names are really cool. Just a little side note that adds to their neatness. But the asteroid looks kind of like the edge of a broken off stick, or something like that. So again, some moths are indeed very kind of dull in order to blend in with their surroundings. However, certainly not all moths are dull. And in fact, a lot of moths are extremely beautiful. Here are just a few examples. That 8-spotted forester is a great one. If there's an area with a lot of Virginia creeper, that's a good spot to look for them. But yeah, those cream spots with those black wings and those orange poofy legs, it's just a fantastic looking moth. There's that wavy lined emerald, that green, very cool green moth. That's what that camouflage looper, that little caterpillar that sticks flower petals and stuff to it to camouflage itself. That's what that turns into, is that wavy line emerald moth, really pretty green moth. The Cecropia moth is our largest moth. Big guys, and my friend got this great picture of 2 of them mating in his yard. But again, really pretty moth. Luna moths, if you've ever seen a Luna moth, I mean, it is just a gorgeous moth, and they're pretty big too. But that green and that purple and that little bit of yellow. And the Luna moth is one of those moths that does not live very long as an adult, about a week. It actually does not have any mouth parts. It doesn't have the proboscis or anything to eat. It only lives long enough to mate, and that's it. It's done. So that's a great one to catch. You know, if you get lucky to catch one during its short lifespan, it's just a gorgeous moth. Some moths even look more like butterflies. And here's just a few examples of ones that, at least to me, look more like butterflies. That white striped black, that little black and white moth, kind of acts more like a skipper, even a skipper butterfly. It likes wooded areas, so that's a good one to look for along a wooded trail, a shady wooded trail, just on the side. But that flower moth is really gorgeous. The orange mint moth, so all really pretty, butterfly looking moths. So don't let anybody tell you moths are dull, because they're not. There's just a few examples from Costa Rica from last year when I was there. And again, just the variety, all the colors, and this is just a small portion. I think I had well over 100 moths and took a lot of moth pictures just because there's just so many. I mean, this one in the upper right looks like some crazy wasp, but it's a moth. It's just mimicking, some type of wasp or bee in order to avoid predation. This one down here with the kind of looks like graffiti or something. So just a ton of variety amongst moths, and a ton of beautiful colors and patterns and even shapes to look forward to when you're out looking for them. Wings rest at their sides flat. Ignore this one, I guess, when you're looking for butterflies and moths. Just because even butterflies themselves, depending on what the butterfly is doing, it might hold its wings either flat or up vertically and together. And same with moths. A lot of moths will, depending on the moth and what the moth is doing, is going to determine how it's holding its wings. Some moths will even roll up their wings around their body, like that bluegrass webworm down there. It doesn't even really look like a moth. It kind of looks like, I don't know what it looks like. It looks like some crazy little critter out of a Miyazaki film or something. Or the plume moths that actually their wings roll up around sort of the base of the wing. So they don't even, again, look like moths either. They kind of look like some other insect. So that's not really, how the butterfly or moth is holding its wings is not a good determination to tell them apart. Feathered or pointed antenna. So this is the one aspect of moths and butterflies that is helpful to tell them apart. Butterflies do have clubbed antennae. They're segmented, and then they have like a bulbous club at the end. As you can see with the two butterflies on the left. The top one is a skipper butterfly, which is a small group of butterflies, and they actually have bent antenna. The club tips are kind of bent, and you can kind of see it in that picture. Moth antenna, they can vary quite a bit. They can be more comb-like that grapeleaf skeletonizer moth, or they can just be long and thin. That hummingbird, or no, it's a snowberry clearwing, down on the sort of bottom left under the moths. That one kind of looks like it has clubbed antenna, but actually it's quite flat. It's hard to kind of see in this photo, but their antennae are pretty flat and flat all the way into the end. They're not bulbous like on a butterfly. And on that spongy moth in the lower right-hand corner, that's kind of, I think, what people typically think of as a moth, like this large feathery antenna, which a lot of moths do have. It just depends on what family they're in and stuff like that. So that can be a very good way to tell the difference, and it's what I use when I'm telling the difference between a butterfly and a moth. Is you got to look at the antenna, and just be aware that moths can have a lot of different variety of antenna. Thick body. This is another one I ignore. Depending on the butterfly, and I don't think of butterflies as really having, thin bodies. If you look at this silver spotted skipper on the upper right, it has, a pretty chunky fat body. It's pretty thick. It's pretty tubular. So I wouldn't consider that a thin body. Even on that tiger swallowtail, it's a pretty thick abdomen that it has. Of course, there are a lot of moths that have thick abdomens, like that maple spanworm. He's super thick. He's a big juicy snack for a bat or a bird or something. He probably doesn't want to get caught. That lettered sphinx down in the lower left, that I would say is pretty comparable to a lot of butterfly sort of shapes. But there's a lot of skinny moths too, like that morning glory plume there, very thin. Again, one that wraps its wings up. So very thin, very T-shaped looking moth. That micro moth down there, Cosmo Trix. I'm not even gonna try to say that name. But that little guy too, again, thin-bodied. It just goes to show the variety in moths. So again, the thickness of the body, I would not rely on as a way to tell moths and butterflies apart, because on both it can vary. All right, so why should we care about moths? Now that we kind of know what makes it a moth, why should we care about moths? That's something I hear, sometimes when I'm serving on my village board is, why should I care about a bumblebee? Why should I care about this bird? Why should I, care about a moth? And there's lots of reasons to care about all those things. But moths in particular, one, they're extremely, extremely important food source for a variety of animals. Not just something like birds where they're extremely crucial food source, but even humans. Not so much in the US, but definitely around the world. Caterpillars especially can be a good food source for humans, but mammals, reptiles, amphibians, a lot of things eat caterpillars and moths. They're extremely important pollinators. And again, because there's so many moths and there's such a diversity of moths, they really are considered one of the drivers in plant diversity as well. And again, if you remember back to me talking about moths evolving, kind of pre the dawn of flowering plants. So, and moths, because they were around during that time and they evolved with those plants, they're considered a big driver in diversity of plants, the plants that we see now. So they're important for that. They also have really cool adaptations, like ultrasonic hearing. Some of them even have sonar jamming, especially I think the hawk moths are one of those groups that have sonar jamming, and that's to help protect them against bats that use sonar in order to find and capture their prey. So a neat adaptation that they evolved with bats. And they're just unique and beautiful, as I think we've covered in what makes them. So when we talk about extremely important to food source, why are caterpillars and moths and butterflies so important to the food web and the ecosystems? And so this my made up picture chart here just kind of tries to break it down a little bit. So everything, all the energy that we have here on this planet, when you really get down to it, and especially our food, comes from the energy from the sun, from the light, and the radiation energy that the sun provides. Plants are the only thing on this planet that can take light directly from the sun and convert it into sugars and other nutrients, food sources for everything else. The problem is a lot of animals cannot eat plants directly because plants have also developed chemicals in them that prevent them from being eaten. They're very bitter, or they're very toxic. So a lot of animals cannot eat those plants directly. And certainly we can't extract nectar, sugars directly from the plant. We do not have the ability to do that. But what can are insects, and especially things like caterpillars. They evolved with those plants to be able to eat them and eat those chemicals, and not die or not get sick. And so when they eat those plants, now they take that energy from the plants, and now it's stored in them, which now can be eaten by other animals. And insects are sort of that bridge on that gap from plants to the rest of the animal kingdom. So many animals depend on insects. And even if you're mostly a carnivore, the things you're eating, if you're, herbivore animals can eat plants. They've developed a way to eat plants, but you might be getting nutrients indirectly from things that eat insects. So um, it's that whole cycle of taking that energy from the plant to the insect to birds and other animals. And then in the adult form, as a butterfly or moth, it gives back to those plants by pollinating them and helping them reproduce. So there's a nice cycle between especially caterpillars and moths and those plants. And again, that's because they evolve together. So why is it so important that we have native plants around? And it's because, again, that evolutionary history, those caterpillars evolved with specific plants in specific regions and are able to eat those plants. So they're able to digest those toxins that are in those plants. So something like an oak tree around here, which is, a heavy hitter in terms of being a host plant, it can support up to, in our region, in the like Midwest region, can host up to 450 species of butterflies and moths. So around that many species can actually feed on that oak tree. They're able to do so. Whereas something like burning bush, which is a popular, ornamental plant that we plant in our yards, can only support maybe up to 15 species, if that. And those are generalist caterpillars that probably are able to feed on our native burning bush, Eastern Wahoo, in that same family. So it might be similar enough that they're able to feed on it. There are some caterpillars that are able to do that, but a lot of them are not. And there's certainly a lot of plants that we plant that they can't feed on at all. I know a ginkgo tree is a very, popular example. And I think English ivy is another one that they don't support any of our native moths or butterflies. Nothing can feed on them. So they're kind of like a statue in our yards, a fake plastic tree, if you will. So, and it's not bad. You can have a plant that's, a statue plant, something that doesn't take away or add ecologically, as long as there's not too many. And that's a problem we run into in our yards now, is that we've replaced a lot of the native stuff with ornamental stuff that does not help our caterpillars, doesn't, help our insects in general. So, and then you have even plants that are non-native and also invasive. So not only are they, not contributing to the food web, to the energy web, they're also now taken away by displacing the plants that are beneficial. So that's why we work really hard in restoration to remove those non-native invasive plants like honeysuckle and buckthorn, and even burning bush, and replace it with native plants in order to not only support our insects, but then in turn support the birds and other animals. So birds in particular need caterpillars. Why do birds need caterpillars? They feed their babies caterpillars. Besides feeding themselves on caterpillars, they also primarily feed their chicks insects. And this is what this chart represents. This was information taken from Ashley Kennedy University, or Ohio State University's experiment, where she took photos, or she went and gathered photos from social media and photographers and stuff like that, and during the breeding season, and looked at what they were eating and what food they were carrying. And if you look at that orange color, that's caterpillars. So the bulk of what many birds, and especially for some birds like vireos, the bulk of it is caterpillars. Same with chickadees. Caterpillars are extremely, extremely important. Gnat catchers, even hummingbirds over here. A hummingbird is, a unique bird that has unique adaptations, but they also feed their young insects, and they do feed their young a little bit of caterpillars. So, you know, birds really need those caterpillars not only to survive, but to thrive and to be able to produce successful offspring. And again, that's what this chart is representing. Excuse me, I'm gonna take a quick drink here. I should note too that where, you know, habitat is so degraded that we have either, you know, not enough native plants, or, you know, definitely, you know, native areas that are really choked out with invasives, we see those bird populations go down. When I do breeding bird surveys, anywhere where there's like a monoculture of even certain native plants, it can be detrimental to birds because there's just no food there. Birds also try to time when to nest by when these caterpillars emerge, when a lot of these, when the food source is really available. And even on migration, they're trying to time when those emergences of caterpillars are happening, so they have that food source to carry them through migration, get through the breeding season, and even fall migration. Caterpillars also, especially, are beneficial for nesting because they're soft. They're soft, they're squishy, they don't have the hard exoskeleton yet that, you know, other insects have, like beetles or spiders or, you know, other insects. So that makes them attractive, as well as they have certain nutrients in them that are extremely important, especially for development. It's same when we think of pollen for bees. You know, in spring you see a lot of dandelions, and you'll see bees visiting dandelions, but dandelions don't have quite the pollen, the protein content in the pollen that the native trees and the native flowers have, that bees really rely on to get their nests going, or rear their, well, they don't really rear their young, I guess, but to produce their offspring. So when you take that food source away, when you take those native plants away, you're going to take away that food source, you're going to take away the insect source, and that's going to affect the birds. It's going to affect other wildlife as well. All right, so no more sad stuff about losing insects. Where can we find and look for moths? Well, the good news is you can find moths pretty much any time of year. I've found moths as late as December and as early as late February. The only time I don't see moths is when you're in like the depths of winter. But if you have a nice, warm, you know, sunny day in winter, you can see a couple moths flying around. I'm still seeing them now, so they're definitely still out there. They become less abundant, definitely during the summer, the warm months when most of the flowers are blooming. You'll definitely see a lot more moths than you will like now. September can also be a good time because you get some of the later moths emerging. Excuse me. You can look for moths virtually anywhere too, which also makes them great. A great thing to just kind of, you know, get into trying to find and find new species. So you can look in gardens, wooden trails are really great places to look, but even fields and prairies, certainly under porch lights and different outdoor lights. You can set up a light sheet to attract moths at night, which is just hanging a sheet, you know, light colored sheet, having a bright light on it, usually, or a black light, like a UV light or a full spectrum bulb. And that, you know, putting that out there at night, leaving it out for a while, and see what moths come up. I also just found a recipe that's supposed to attract moths, and it's beer, brown sugar, and bananas. And you make a paste out of that, put it on trees, and then go out and you know, with your flashlight and see what's coming to visit your secret moth brew. But one of the best ways to find moths is to attract them to your yard. And you'll also be supporting moths in your yard. And there's a few ways you can do that, and we'll get into it. But I want to stress that no yard is too small. I have a friend who every spring I dig up a few plants from my yard, I put them in containers, and she puts them out on her little balcony in her apartment. And she gets, a few butterflies, she gets some moths, she gets hummingbirds, katydids. So just on her little balcony with her few potted plants, she supports life, and she supports, our native life. So don't think just because you have a tiny little yard, or maybe you only have a back porch and maybe you can only do potted plants. You can plant natives in potted plants and certainly help support insects that way. So definitely number one thing you can do is plant natives. Plant native trees or shrubs, especially. And why trees and shrubs? Because they are the ones that make up the bulk of the host plants. They'll support more species of moths and butterflies than most forbs and grasses, or flowers and grasses. But you should plant a bunch of flowers and grasses as well for forage habitat. So you provide a lot of food, especially if you're providing flowers that bloom throughout different times of the year and have different physical attributes to attract different types of moths or butterflies or bees. Excuse me. You want to remove invasive species. Again, if you have, like a ginkgo, using the standard example, you don't have to chop it down and get something, a native per se. But things like buckthorn, if you have a burning bush, maybe it's starting to die, maybe think about replacing it with something native. And there's oftentimes a lot of good, native plants that will replace the non-native that you have, that have similar attributes, that maybe have similar appearance, similar colors, similar flower, whatever it is, but a good alternative to maybe what you already have. So starting to remove that stuff that's really detrimental is a good idea, and reducing lawn and replacing it with natives. I think we don't think of habitat loss or habitat fragmentation in our own yards, in our own neighborhoods, but that is a huge amount of fragmentation that has happened in our environment. I think the estimate is there's 80 million acres of non-native grass sod lawn across the United States, the lower 48. Which is a ton of habitat. That's a ton of habitat that we've taken all the natives out, we plowed over the prairies, we cut down the forest, we filled in the marsh, and we just put in a bunch of stuff from, foreign countries that just doesn't do anything, and sometimes is actually very harmful and very costly, not only just to our native environment, but a lot of times agriculture and a lot of other aspects of our economy and whatnot. So, if we start to, rethink how we manage our yards and, start to say, hey, you know what, we don't need, all this lawn. We can just take a little bit of it and start, putting some flowers in there instead, maybe put some grasses in there. I think if we start to do that, think of all that habitat. We'll kind of refill in with usable habitat instead of this dead, ecologically kind of useless habitat we have now in a lot of our neighborhoods. I think we really need to start thinking that way in order to curb the insect apocalypse, so to speak. So this is probably this is an obvious one, I think. Avoid pesticide use, especially outside your house. I mean, if you have obviously a really bad, problem with something, you should get it addressed, obviously, especially if it's in your home. But outside your house, there's not, a lot of reason to, blast pesticides all over the place. It's really detrimental to our insect populations. Certainly things like mosquito fogging is a big problem. Unfortunately, the even the natural types of sprays they use are not only not effective, but they do kill other beneficial insects. There's nothing that targets just mosquitoes specifically. There's other insects that get effective. And it's not really an effective method to kill mosquitoes. Larval treatments are really the way to make sure to address mosquitoes. And you can make a real simple mosquito trap by getting like a 5-gallon bucket, throwing some hay on top or some leafy kind of stuff, and then putting those larval dunks that you can get pretty much anywhere, like hardware, S-store, like Menards, Lowe's, something like that. And setting up a mosquito trap basically in your own yard is way more effective than, hiring a company to come out and fog your whole yard and, pretty much blast everything in there. Another thing I try to stress to people is, if you have neighborhood-wide mosquito fogging, go to your village meetings, your town board meetings, your HOA meetings, and advocate to stop it or reduce it. I'm on my village board, and I am in charge of the mosquito abatement program in my village. And, for years, it's been a slow, crawl kind of to get people out of the, mindset that we need mosquito spraying, that we need to do this. And it helps when there's other voices in the neighborhood coming from the residents that that's what you want, that you don't want to just spray mosquito spray. You want to address mosquitoes in a different way, in a more effective way, that doesn't harm our native, our beneficial insects, our bees, our moths, our butterflies. So, going to your board meetings and those meetings, and just, there's always a public comment section, just saying, hey, I've noticed we're doing this and it's really not helpful. Maybe we can think of another way. I cannot tell you how much it helps to have your voice at those meetings, because a lot of times us as board members or whatever, we don't know. And we need to hear from you what you want. So that's something that I'm seeing in my neighborhood now, and it's great. It's so awesome now to have people, not just one person, but now 2, 3, 4 people saying, hey, why are we doing this? Let's rethink this. So that's great, and it's helpful to add your voice to that. So allow your caterpillars to complete development. I think this is something that even if we do, come in and say, I'm going to plant an oak. Here we go. I planted oak in front of my house, but now, I let the lawn grow right up to the base of the tree, or I put, 3 feet of mulch around the tree, or some wood mulch, I should say. We're kind of creating a death trap for these caterpillars, because part of their development is, the adult will lay an egg on a leaf of the tree or whatever the host plant is. That leaf falls to the ground. That larva, a lot of them, will spend time in the soil as part of their development. Well, when we have lawn that we're mowing underneath those trees, that compacts the soil. It makes it difficult for those caterpillars to get down in the soil to complete their life cycle. Same with if we put a ton of mulch around trees, especially lots of layers of mulch. That can create a trap almost, where we have this great tree or shrub or whatever it is that is a great host plant for these caterpillars, but now they try to get to the ground, and we basically put like concrete there for them. So instead, what we should be doing is creating soft landings under trees, especially under trees and shrubs. We should be planting native and leaving the leaves and plant litter. A lot of insects in general, bees, and definitely caterpillars, will overwinter in that leaf litter, in that plant litter. That's their home. That's what's going to keep them warm. and protected. So, every fall, I see all these people battling the leaves that fall, and oh, I got to get every single leaf off the ground, and we act like it's garbage. We act like these leaves are someone's trash that they threw out their car window, and now it's on our lawn, and we have to get out there immediately and remove it. But it's not. It's the tree's natural way of recycling nutrients. So where you can, and especially if you have garden beds, throw those leaves in those garden beds. It'll all break down. It will turn into beautiful compost and soil. Will help retain moisture for your plants over winter. To me, there's no reason to get rid of the leaves. When I see people throwing away their leaves or burning them, and then the next spring they're buying soil and they're buying mulch, and it's like you burned it all in fall. You burned all that mulch and soil that you could have had now by just leaving those leaves and letting them compost naturally and break down and provide food and nutrients for the plants, for all the little critters that run around in your yard. So I think changing that mindset of, even in native gardens, I see people going in there and just cleaning it up, just like getting, chopping everything down and blowing out all the leaves. And it's like, just leave them alone. That's where the plants are. That's where birds are going to go hunt for food. That's where other animals are going to overwinter and hide. It's so important just to, start to just leave it be. Just let it go. And let those caterpillars and other creatures use those leaves, that litter, all that the way it was intended to be used. All right, so lastly, an important thing we can do to help caterpillars thrive in our own yards and in our own neighborhoods, really, is to reduce light pollution. When we leave lights on outside, it attracts moths and other bugs, as I'm sure we all know. You walk outside and there's things like hitting you in the head, June bugs and stuff like that, because they're attracted to the light. And what we don't realize is when a moth is attracted to a light, not only is it now wasting time by the light instead of being out breeding or foraging or doing something else, it's wasting its life, so to speak. It's usually short life on that light or around that light. It can also cause dehydration. It can make them susceptible to predators. It can cause temporary blindness in moths. So it's helpful to just leave those lights off at night. If you need to have a light, if you're worried about, unsavory people in your neighborhood, or you work late, so you need a light on at night to, get in your house or whatever. Use a yellow bulb. Those tend to attract less moths and butterflies and other insects than like blue wavelength lights. So try to use a yellow bulb and use a motion detector if you can. There's a lot of cheap, go to Menards, you can find a motion detector light. And it will help, not only you'll save money too from electricity, you'll have that light there when you need it, and it won't be there when you don't need it. So that's another way to kind of work around the light pollution. And then don't use those bug zappers. I get into a fight every time I go down to my family cottage with my dad, because we have a big old school round bug zapper. And he likes to turn it on because it's killing all those mosquitoes, and I'm always running over and unplugging it. So we battle back and forth, plugging it in and unplugging it. But if you stand around those bug zappers and actually look at what bugs are going into that zapper, you will notice that it's definitely not all mosquitoes. There's moths going in there, there's mayflies, there's dobson flies, there's a ton of beneficial insects, a lot of bird food, a lot of potential food for animals that are just getting zapped by that light. And you're definitely not putting any dent in the mosquito population using those. So, and they're noisy and annoying. I hate those things. So don't use those things. They're not going to get rid of the bugs. Or at least not the bugs you want to get rid of, the mosquitoes. All right. So last slide. You guys all made it. Good job. So identification help. Moths are very tricky to identify, one, because there's so many of them. You know, when you're flipping through a field guide and you got hundreds, thousands that you're trying to, you know, compare your photo to and try to figure out like, oh, which one is it? It can be impossible. Or it just takes a lot of time. It can be very difficult. And again, moths are tricky. They don't even look the same sometimes among the same family. They can have different shapes and sizes and colors and look very different. So it's tricky. What's best to do, or at least what I do, is go to the experts. And there's a lot of databases out there. One I use all the time is butterfliesandmoths.org. I've been using them for years. It's a big database, kind of, if you've ever used eBird for birds, same sort of concept. You get a picture of a moth or butterfly and you load it in to their database. You fill out a couple questions like when and where you saw it and stuff like that. And then you submit it and they'll identify it for you. And then it will go into their database and their records for moths occurrences or butterfly occurrences. So it's a citizen science project too. When you're contributing to these databases, bugguide.net's a really good one. iNaturalist is a really popular one as well, that can help you ID your findings, and you're also contributing to that database of sightings, which a lot of scientists use, not just, you know, people studying insects, but people studying birds or other animals that feed off these insects. These can be really helpful to access these databases where you have just a ton of sightings to reference and a ton of data to reference. So when you need ID help, get on one of those sites, try to get a picture, and yeah, start your own life list for butterflies and moths. I have over 200 now. I know I have more than that because I haven't submitted a lot from Costa Rica and Panama, but yeah, it's a fun activity just to get into too. Yep. Oh, and I forgot to switch to the last slide with contact information. But if you have, you know, questions about, you know, native gardening or moths or birds or anything like that, feel free to email me. And I'll try to answer your question as best as I can, or get whatever information. I do have a list of like resources and native plants and stuff like that. If anybody wants that, feel free to email me and I'll forward you that information as well.